bit difficult. And though there is no verse in the Bible that says the Christian life is one of adventure, not that you should add anything to the Bible, but I think we could imply that. And looking at all of the faithful Christians that are mentioned in the New Testament, even those that are faithful to God that you see in the Old Testament, their lives are completely saturated and filled with adventure. In fact, some of my favorite stories that I heard growing up were from missionaries and were from preachers who got to travel all around. They stayed with us, and they would tell us these stories about their travels and the things that they had been through, and some of them were absolutely unbelievable. We're going to talk about Paul today, and I want to start off with his giving the sign of wave.
Is the mic on?
It's not on. Sounds really loud. Oh, blinking red. Yeah, I think it might be out back. Let's see what's up there. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll just screen the first half. Maybe first third here. There you go. All right, I'll just try to talk really loud right here. But Paul starts off with in Philippians, and he says, I can do anything, I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me. And if you look at his life and his adventures that you see, especially throughout the book of Acts, you see all these different locations that he goes to, all these circumstances that he finds himself in, and it is absolutely incredible what he makes it through. And we're going to focus today, if you want to open up your Bibles to Acts chapter 27. We're going to start in 27, and we're going to look at 28. And I want to kind of look at Paul's ministry and Paul's life through our minds this morning, and kind of through our own perspective here, and how we would face these circumstances if we were in them instead of Paul. And here's the mic. Ooh, it is a lot harder to scream now. Oh, what a relief. Okay. My voice was going to be shot the rest of this week. Okay. So if you didn't hear that, we're going to be in Acts chapter 27 and Acts chapter 28. And I want us to put our minds where Paul is and maybe run through some of the things that we would be saying. I think some realistic thoughts that we would be having if we were put into the same position. And then basically what I want to look at is how Paul is able to hold himself together and under all of this crisis and these disasters, how he's able to mentally keep it together and keep on pushing forward. And as he does this, he inspires everybody around us, around him then, and he inspires all of us today as we look at the things that he has made it through. I can remember at 10 years old, we had these at Bear Valley, the church that I grew up at, we had these door knocking days. And I remember I initially got up in the morning for the donuts that were offered there before we all grouped up together. But then your heart started to pound as you're handed this stack of flyers and you're told to go out into the community and knock on the doors. And I remember one instance, me and Carl went to go door knock by ourselves, and we were young, and we got sugar on our face probably from the donuts. We got these stack of flyers that are also sticky from donuts, and we're walking up there, and we're like doing rock, paper, scissors on who's going to do the talking once we get to the door. And it was an adrenaline rush, and we had the door slammed in our faces a couple times. There were some loud dogs that were barking in the window that made you kind of second guess if you were actually going to go up and knock on this door, how badly this person might need Jesus. And we went through that whole day, and we made it. And as you grow up, we realize, wow, it takes a whole lot of courage to be a Christian, and it's more than just door knocking. But it's going to another country where there is a lot of scary bugs, a lot of scary diseases, and for me, you have to go to the doctor, and you have to get shots and stuff like that. Just not a fan. But when you look at Paul and how he keeps it together through his mission trips, it's not because he got those shots before he went overseas. It's not because of the group of people that he's with even necessarily, but it's because of the help that he has from God. It's because of that relationship that he has with God, and most of all, it's because of the promises that God makes to him. And we're going to look at a few of those. So we're going to be in Acts chapter 27 and 28, but all of this kind of starts back in Acts 23, and we'll refer to that in just a second. But if you look at, starting in verse 39, Paul is now, he's a prisoner. And if you look at the events that take place, it is a roller coaster of emotions that take place, and it has to be a roller coaster of emotions in Paul's head. And we know that Paul, from his writings to the Corinthian church, that he is ready to die. He's ready to die at any moment. He's very confident in his own salvation. But it has to be scary nonetheless, and especially looking at a death like this, a death by shipwreck. if he is shackled or if he is tied up because he is a prisoner. Being in a storm, being in the water in that situation is just not a great way to go. But we also see here that the soldiers were thinking about killing him before they even got to this island here. So we're going to start in verse 39 and just read for a second. It says, "Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land," which is strange because they had been to this place before, "but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. And so they cast off the anchors and they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach, but striking the reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf." And verse 42, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape, which, to take a side note here, why would they be concerned about the prisoners here? Well, as Roman guards, if any of those prisoners ever came back, and they find out later that they are on the island of Malta, connection to Rome here, that if any of them did get away, if they did make their escape, then it was going to come back on those Roman soldiers, and it was going to be their life for it. So they decided they're going to kill these prisoners. But in verse 43, you see the providence of God at work here. "But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who would swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest on planks, those that could not swim or perhaps tied up, or on pieces of the ship, so that it was that all were brought safely to land." And if you look in verse 36, that number is 276 people. All survived this shipwreck. Now, if you're Paul in this situation, you have this promise from God that you're going to make it at least to Rome. And we're going to look at that in just a second in Acts chapter 23, where Paul has to be courageous once again. So he goes to Jerusalem. Paul has this Pharisaical background. He's trained as a Pharisee. And he gets to Jerusalem, and there's all of the council there, and he's there to testify, and he gives this very bold message to the Pharisees and to the Sadducees that are there. And it's very interesting, if you look in Acts chapter 23, that Paul looks, and it says that he observes. As he's speaking to these people, he observes that half of them are Pharisees, and half of them are Sadducees. And one half believes in the resurrection of Christ, one half does not believe in the resurrection of Christ, that being the Sadducees. And so Paul says that I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees, and I am saved because of the resurrection. And he starts this giant fight between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because one believes in a resurrection and one doesn't. And he's pulled out of there and taken back to the barracks, it says at the end of Acts 23 there, because they were afraid that the crowd was going to pull Paul apart. So if you look at every instance that Paul finds himself in, when he's on Mars Hill, and he's confronting those that are very idolatrous, and then he's here, he's preaching for God, he's proclaiming for God, he's about to get pulled apart by this crowd, then he gets taken away. But what I love is in Acts chapter 23, towards the end of it, the Lord confronts Paul and stands next to him and says that he is going to be with him and that he needs him to testify in Rome. So you have this promise going in beforehand. But would you question the promise of God there? If you were in the same circumstances as Paul is, you're about to be shipwrecked onto this island, would you question God's promise then? In Acts 23, we know God already promises Paul, you're going to make it to Rome. Just as you've testified for me here at Jerusalem, I need you to go and do that in Rome. He hasn't gotten to Rome yet, but now he's facing a situation where the Roman soldiers are thinking about killing him. Even if they don't kill him, he's going to be thrown into the surf, perhaps tied up there. He could drown before he even gets onto the shore. Would you be questioning the promises of God? I think it's a very human thing to do, especially in the church today, to question God's promises. And to think that maybe God forgot about me. Or maybe God forgot about this promise. I mean, God has been around for a long time, and that's a very hard and difficult thing to think about, how long God has been around, because that concept forever is very difficult to get our minds wrapped around here. But thinking maybe some along the way I just kind of slipped through the cracks. And so God's promises to me are not going to happen. And maybe we won't actually say those things out loud, but we start living and acting as if God forgot about his promises to us. Well, Paul eventually makes it to the island, but it's not over. He gets onto the island, which ironically is the island of Malta, which means place of refuge. And it doesn't seem like it, because when they get to this island, yes, there are some friendly natives there that could imply that there's refuge with these very friendly natives. And Luke writing this, he is writing as if he is an actual eyewitness and knows something more about this island here. But they arrive, and it's cold, and it's wet, and it's miserable, and they're on the island of refuge. But I want you to notice something about Paul, and it's kind of a look into his character here. Paul begins to help them collect firewood and put this fire together. So if you wanted to play the victim, if you had the right to play the victim, here is where you would have that right. Because you just went through the shipwreck, you're in the freezing cold, so why don't you let those very friendly islanders go and collect all of the firewood for themselves? But Paul doesn't. He jumps in there, he begins to collect all of this firewood with them just because he is such a servant. And in the middle of serving, in the middle of traveling on this mission trip, in the middle of being a prisoner and trying to make his way to Rome, in the middle of all of this, he gets bit by a viper. Now, I don't know how many of you here, your number one fear is snakes. They're not mine, but this would make me pass out. But I want you to look at Paul's reaction here, and then we're going to look at the view of the people, at the onlookers here, and look at how very human and how very applicable that is for us today, especially within what I'm going to call church culture. All right, so picking right back up in 28, it says, after they were brought safely through, when they learned that the island was called Malta, the native people showed us unusual kindness, which I think is unusual phrasing. Unusual kindness, or just extra smiley and huggy. For they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, but it had begun to rain and it was cold, and when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand. Now, I'm not a reptile expert, but because of the cold, the snake was probably in some kind of hibernation, was not moving, was kind of lethargic, and then as soon as that fire started to warm up, it became alive and it said, oh, hey, I'm a viper, I'm nice and active again. First arm that it gets within reach latches on. It doesn't just hang on by one little fang or take a nibble there at Paul, but we see that it actually hangs on to his arm. Now, I'm trying to see how many people are squeamish here to see who is really afraid of snakes here. But if you held your arm up and you saw a giant viper hanging off of your arm, your reaction is probably not going to be what Paul's reaction is here. Starting in verse 4, but when the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. He, however, shook the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. Very nonchalant move on a very John Wayne move, I think, on Paul's part here. There's this viper hanging off of his hand, and he doesn't scream. His eyes doesn't get wide. And I'm wondering, as Luke is a physician and he's writing this, if he was a witness to these events, if his eyes got wide as he saw that and goes, oh, I know what this means. I know what that venom's going to do. It's going to cause that paralysis. It's going to cause all these terrible things. It's going to be a slow and painful death. But Paul shakes it off into the fire and suffers no harm. But notice verse 6. I want you to look at the wording here. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they waited a long time, they saw no misfortune had come to him, and they changed their minds, and they said he was a god. So from a murderer to a god. But I want to back up and talk about this again from Paul's perspective, and maybe try and put this into our own personal lives here. How many times we've thought about that we were trying our best to serve God. We're doing everything that we can. We're going above and beyond. And we're trying to serve God, and then disaster strikes right in the middle of that. And after everything leading up to this point, and the circumstances that Paul finds himself in, Paul does not snap here, which is what I would expect. If you look at his court, probably did not have that much sleep. And he's in this shipwreck, and he lands on the shore, and then it starts raining, and it's cold, and it's miserable. And God is supposed to be looking out for him, and we feel like God is looking out for us, and we have those promises that he is. But sometimes we forget and think that maybe he's not looking right now, or maybe he's not paying attention right now. But when that snake comes out of the fire, Paul does not lose his cool there. He doesn't shake it off and say, are you kidding me? This is how I'm going to go. This is how I'm going to die after everything that I've been through. After preaching boldly in Jerusalem, and then after that going up to various leaders where he could easily be executed for the message that he preaches there. After all of these things, he doesn't lose his cool. And I think it goes back to Acts chapter 23, and even before that, as he grows in that relationship with God. But God makes that promise to him, I've got a job for you to do. I've got something for you to go do. You need to testify for me in Rome. And so, of course, he had the ability to shake off of that snake that was on his hand. But now changing it over to those onlookers that look, they're waiting for him to die. It's a very rough thing to be trying to live to the best of your ability at the Christian life and have people that are looking at you, looking at your life with doubt and saying, okay, well, he's tried to quit whatever sin, you can fill in the blank. He's tried to quit this or that before, and it's never worked out. He's just going to go right back into his old ways. He's just going to turn and go right back into what he was doing before. This whole church thing, it's not going to work out. And how many times we have people in our lives maybe that are expecting us to fail? You have people that basically, they're friendly. We know they're friendly natives, but still, he gets bit by a snake and they all just stand there and watch. It doesn't say anywhere that they tried to rescue him, they tried to take him to to a doctor or anything. It says they stood there and they watched him to see what would happen, to see if he would die. We already know from before that, their mind immediately went to the worst. And sometimes as humans, that's what happens. We immediately think the worst of somebody. Snake bites him in the arm, and it's not, oh no, we should probably help this missionary, this man that's working with God and trying to live his life for God. He's a murderer. That's what happened. He couldn't escape justice. He got off the boat, but because he's a murderer, he got bitten by a snake. And we do that all the time. We question people's motives, and we think, like, yeah, you're just doing this because you just want us to think you're great or you're all that, or whatever scenario comes to your mind that's personal for you. We know people like that. We've been through scenarios like that before where people are just waiting for us to fail, or when people are automatically thinking the worst of us. But on the flip side of that, after they realize he's not going to die and they think he's a god, look at the human responses to this thing. That either he's a murderer or he's a god. One of the biggest lessons we can pull out of this is we have to be careful about what we think of other people, whether good or bad. If we think they're the best person in the entire world or they're the worst person in the entire world, we have to be careful at how we view people and how we think of people, because in the end of the day, God's the only one that knows the heart. But Paul makes it through this on account of the promises of God. God doesn't forget him. But I want us to look at how he's able to keep it together and then remind ourselves when, I don't know what everyone is going through right now at this moment, or if you are in a very stressful part of your life or not, or what exactly all of those details are. But if you feel like snapping, or if you feel like losing your cool, or if you're on the very verge, you're at the end of your rope, just remember God doesn't forget his promises. I think sometimes maybe we think that we have this mindset, maybe we call it a martyr mindset if you want, that we think that when life gets bad, the only thing that we have to look forward to, the only way that God is going to take care of us is in the future in heaven. So we just write this earth off and we say, like, well, like I'm living down here as a poor lowly Christian, and so I'm just going to have to wait until I die and then I go to heaven. And that's my reward. But I want you to look, after all of these things happen, we see that Paul is taken care of, and Paul and his group are taken care of as they go to this leader's house. They go to an estate, and there's this man that turns out that he's sick, and Paul goes from being the one in need of healing to being the healer here as he goes to this house that is someone, starting in verse 8, it says, "It happened that the father Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, he healed him." This is right after all of these events take place. Verse 9, "And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They honored us greatly, and when we were all about to set sail, they put on board whatever we needed. After 3 months, we set sail, and we went and wintered in the islands, a ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead, putting at Syrakus." I didn't look up the pronunciation for that. "We stayed there for 3 days, and from there we made a circuit and arrived in Rheum." So right after all of this happens, Paul turns into the healer, and then he's taken care of. So you have these seasons of life that we have, and that's how it works. We have these seasons in life, maybe these months, maybe it seems like these years of life where we're going through all of these difficulties, but it's a season. God takes care of us here. God gives Paul a break on earth. He doesn't say, well, Paul, you serve me as much as you want here, as hard as you can here, and just remember, heaven's on the way. Heaven's coming. That's true. And that is a hopeful and great thought to think about, that no matter how bad this life gets, we do have heaven. Heaven is on the way. We also have to remember that God takes care of us here too. God does provide that relief and those seasons of relief. I couldn't help but think that when it's been a pretty rough week. Carl got in a motorcycle wreck. I was scared for him. It was just a roller coaster of emotions there too. But when I had that moment when you get to sit and you get to have the Lord's Supper and have communion with all of your Christian family and friends, no matter how crazy the week is, that is the moment that I look forward to. When I can sit there and I can reflect and I can pray and I can thank God for the sacrifice that he made for me, and I get to do it with my family here. It's relief. It's relief from the world. Steve calls Wednesday the peak of the week. It's a step away from everything. Our hope is not just in heaven. God takes care of us here as well, and it's because we have those promises. If you're a faithful Christian, if you're a part of that family, then you get to enjoy those promises of God too. And you get to realize that God is with you as well. He is taking care of you as well. But if you're not, well, then you don't get to enjoy those blessings. You know, we talk about, I think too often, maybe sometimes, we can linger on the fact that Christians have to put up with so much and we have to suffer so much in this life. And maybe we don't focus on the joys of being a Christian and how great and how wonderful it is to be a Christian. I hope this has been a reminder in looking at these events that take place in Paul's life. It looks like a bunch of terrible things are happening, but you can still see God at work in his life. And if you're a faithful Christian, then God is at work in your life as well. If you're going through a season of hardship, then it's just my encouragement to you to hang on. Don't lose your cool. Don't blame it on God, but cling to God, because God is the one that's going to get you through this season of hardship, and God will take you to the other side. If you're not a Christian this morning, you would like to be a part of that family, you would like all of those blessings of being in Christ, then this morning is for you. If you'd like to make that change and start that walk with God, then why not come right now as together we stand and as we sing.